Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
All right, well, welcome to Meet the Author. My name is Joe Nash. Today we're talking to Joe Dalton. You probably know him from the Times-Union. He's been writing arts reviews and art stories since 2002. And the book is called Artists and Activists, Making Culture in New York's Capital Region. And the book is a collection of Joe's writing, not the reviews, but his writing of the art scene, a really wide range. So welcome, Joe.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Before we talk about the book and your writing and everything, I always ask people to talk about, give us the capsule biography, so you can maybe tell us about yourself so people sort of know you a little.
Okay. I was born and raised in Texas, and I studied music in college, and I found I was one of the more level-headed music majors and with modest talents. So I went directly into arts management, and I studied arts administration. My undergrad was at Catholic University in Washington, D.C., and arts management back in Texas at Southern Methodist University. And while the last part of graduate school was a full-time internship, and I wanted to try out New York City, just as a trial, I was an intern at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. I was always drawn to the avant-garde, and so I worked for a season with the Next Wave Festival. And I stayed on in New York for 13 years. I worked at CBS Masterworks, which is now known as Sony Classical, for 3 years. That was exciting. I did primarily administrative work, but I was there during Leonard Bernstein's 70th birthday year. We had a lot of reissues with that. Philip Glass was on the label at the time, as well as all kinds of other famous people. So I had a little bit of...
So you produced classical?
I didn't produce the CBS.
Oh, you mean you worked in the business?
You know, the number, I did copyright registrations, and the little number that's on the side of the spine of a record, I kept track of those numbers.
After all that training?
Well, exactly. But I learned the record business for 3 years at the largest record label at the time in the world.
And it was classical?
Classical.
Okay.
And then I went from there, from that huge place, to an itty-bitty label that was the music that I loved, and it was called Composers Recordings Incorporated, CRI. And it was founded in 1954 as a non-profit record label dedicated to American music. And I ran that for 10 years. I left New York City in 2000, tried living in the country upstate, found I wasn't a country person, and settled in Albany. And being in the right place at the right time. And actually, I'd always thought something I could do in the music world and live outside New York City would be to be a critic, and it happened in Albany. And
well, what I wanted to ask you was, after over 10 years in the business, and you suddenly are writing about, were you always a writer? Did you just start from scratch? Or?
I certainly didn't start from scratch for the Times-Union. My mother was a journalist, so I think I have some either training that started early on, or maybe it's in the blood, I don't know. She's not a journalist of any renown, but that was her training.
Okay.
And running a nonprofit organization requires writing, requires grant writing. At CRI, the record label I managed, we produced 300 CDs in 10 years, and I edited the liner notes for 300 CDs.
Oh, geez. Okay.
So grant writing, liner notes, promotional copy. We were a staff of, in a good period, we were 4 of us.
And you had to do everything.
At other times, there were 2.5 of us running this little operation. So yes, a lot of writing.
So it says you've already filed something like, since 2002, over 800 stories for the Times-Union.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I wanted to ask you, one thing in your book that you do when you talk about all these local artists, and there's many in here, you always devote a little paragraph to how they ended up in the Capital District. So how did you end up here? And so you said,
well, that's astute. I'm glad to know. I'm glad to know that. Like I said, I tried living upstate. I found I wasn't a country person, and I had some consulting work in New York City. I wanted to stay on the East Coast. I wanted to stay somewhat in proximity to, and I didn't want to be able to commute into Manhattan and be drawn, sucked back into it. But I was in Washington County, and like I said, it wasn't suiting me, so I wound up in Albany, and it was actually, I was coming back on Amtrak. It's a cute story. It's the kind of story of being in the right place at the right time. I was in New York City for 4 or 5 days and was on Amtrak, and I ended up sitting next to Marion Roach, who wrote the introduction to my book.
She works at the Times Union?
No, her husband is Rex Smith, the editor of the Times Union. And we were chatting, you know, sometimes you don't want to chat too much with the person you're sitting next to for a long drive, but eventually we started talking. And she said, "You're fascinating." You know, I said I was a consultant in classical music, and she said, "What does that mean?" And I said, "It means whatever I can get." And she said, "Well, maybe the paper should write about you. My husband's the editor." Okay. And I said, "Do they need a classical music writer?" And they did.
Well, that is the right place at the right time.
Exactly.
Jeez.
Within a couple of months, that was like May, and by the beginning of July, I was driving to Glimmerglass and covering opening night at Glimmerglass, and it was pretty great.
Excellent. And so that's good, very good. So I guess what I'm going to ask you about, the book is a lot of profiles, but you are the critic. Let's talk about reviewing before we talk about some of this other stuff. What does the critic have a job? Like when you go to Albany Symphony, or if you're going to Glimmerglass, or if you're going over to Tanglewood or whatever, or if you're going to Jacob's Pillow or whatever, do you have a job other than to say this is good or bad? Or how do you see the critic's job?
I think I go as a reporter. I go to say what it was like to be there and to give a fair assessment, particularly if it's something like Glimmerglass that's going to, it's an opera that's going to be in repertory for the next 2 months. What a person can reasonably expect to encounter there. And the Albany Symphony will do a program once, maybe twice, but by the time my review comes out, someone else. Yeah, but still to give a feeling of what it was like to be there. And I think if a critic gives a fair description, opinion comes through. So it's not so much I think this or I think that. It's what it was like to be there, and how the experience compares to a standard within that art form. So you know, or a bad, you know, it's not news to say they played at a professional level and they were well rehearsed. I try to never to say that. Part of my job also is to write something that's good to read, that is enjoyable reading, even if you don't necessarily follow the art form or you don't have an intention of going, that's worth 2 minutes, 3 minutes while you're flipping through the paper. So something that's worth reading and that is above a mere you know, saying Yo-Yo Ma is a great cellist. You know, how many times can you say that? But to point out something of the experience of watching this singer or this cellist, so to provide some insight and provide a context within the longer I cover an institution, context within the arch of what they're doing, context within the greater field.
Okay. Now, what I was going to ask you, I emailed you this question, so I don't.
Okay.
Yesterday.
I hope I thought about it.
But I said, is it difficult to be critical? And then I said, well, hopefully I can explain that question better, but I don't know if I can. But what I mean is, when I go to something, a Broadway play or symphony or down to Bard or something, I'm always overwhelmed at the time and effort and money and creativity that goes into something. And I'm thinking, well, who am I to say, you know, is it difficult to be critical when you're...
I would guess, I have to say no.
Okay, well, that's fair.
I'm passionate about this art, and I didn't start these art forms that I cover. I mean, the book has a broad overview of the arts, but my reviewing is classical music, symphonies, chamber music, and opera. That's principally what I review. And every summer I also do New York. For 3 weeks a year I become a ballet critic. But and these are art forms though that I followed and I'm passionate about, and I have to say, I have to empathize with you in that, particularly if you go to a Broadway show, you're kicking in $100. You're probably gonna have dinner, and if you live up here, you've got travel. It's understandable that you're going to want to say that was great, because otherwise it's like, what a waste of, you know. If you hate, you're not going to want to hate it. You're going to want to affirm your own investment in the experience. I, 100 shows a year or something I experience. So, and I don't pay for the tickets. So I am not invested the same way. I see a lot of things, and some things seem better than others. Something that's not part of the job is affirming someone else's taste. It's not my job to promote these organizations. I'm promoting the art form in general by giving space in the newspaper, but it's not my job to affirm other people's taste. And I'll point out something that I've gotten, now and then I go to the critics conferences and I ask, or I'll observe also if we all go to a show, if other critics applaud. And
you mean what you're there watching?
Among the audience members,
okay.
yeah. And when I was in New York City, I went to a heck of a lot of concerts. I observed that the New York Times critics kept their hands in their lap, and they did not applaud.
No matter what? Or?
No matter what. And I did that, and I have followed that practice. Early on, I thought I would be polite and applaud, and I thought I would draw less attention to myself and applaud. And what I found is first of all, everything gets a big ovation, and the vast majority of things I go to get a standing ovation, which means very little. And if you begin to applaud with other people, you become swept up into their feelings. Oh yes, it really was good, and all of a sudden, maybe I shouldn't mention that the soprano was flat in her aria. So I try and have a bit of distance. And at the same time, while I interview these artists, I try not to fraternize. I'm often, if I do a preview of a concert, the artist will often say, well, come backstage and say hello afterward. I never do that because I don't want to have too much of a familial bond with these people.
So you're trying not to be too chummy with them.
Exactly.
Does that help?
Yeah.
Well, you do say in the introduction, though, a sympathetic critic can be sort of a link between artists and audiences. Do you mean that as in trying to get people to enjoy that art form more, or to come to that?
Exactly.
I mean, when you're writing about opera, are you subtly trying to advocate for opera?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I mean, the majority. I hope what it was like to be there. I hope I can communicate the thrill of when your seat vibrates with the sound or something, the thrill, the experience of being part of something that is so overwhelming and beautiful. And yes, I hope I am being, in the broad sense, being an advocate. And when I'm critical, I'm still being an advocate because I want high standards.
Well, before you mentioned the standards, if you're seeing a famous opera or a musical symphony, do you sort of measure it against the greatest version you ever heard of that, kind of?
Well,
or you try to block all that out and do what you're...
Yeah, it's a fine line. I'm still relatively young, and so there are still major works that I have not heard live. Again, when I go to the critics conferences, sometimes I'll hear an old timer walk out at intermission and say, "That's not the way I heard Toscanini do it," and I'm like, "Hey, there are shining moments in any arts goer's history. But it's not about always comparing to the greatest thing that's ever happened. This brings up a matter of recordings, and classical recordings are a highly refined art form. And if you judge concerts in comparison to recordings, no concert will ever compare.
On the recordings, don't they just do it till they get it?
Exactly. They edit and they edit and they edit. So. It's very much about being in context, being present, what it's like to experience it live, and the interpretation of the artist at that time. And was it a hot night? Was it literally hot and humid? Does that have an effect on the sound of the violin?
Oh, okay.
Things like that.
You do know a lot about music. So. How do you, as an example, if you're going to review a symphony or a classical music evening, what is it that you would look for? I mean,
did I have an emotional experience?
Okay.
That would be the key thing.
But do you bring that
last-
to all your arts that you review?
Oh, above all, I want to be moved.
Yeah, okay.
Sure. I mean, that's the highest. Last year at the Berkshire Opera, which, as far as I know right now, is now defunct, but the best opera I saw last year was The Marriage of Figaro. And in the third act, the Figaro and his wife, his new wife, were rolling around on stage and singing together, and I wiped my eyes, and the woman next to me was crying. And that was the lead of my story. That doesn't happen very often.
Is that usually not done that way, rolling while you're trying to sing? Is that?
Oh, right. That was kind of fun too.
Okay.
Just in the fact that their bodies were prone. It was unusual staging. It wasn't outrageous. They didn't move it to Mars or sometimes there's weird things done with opera, but I had an emotional reaction. Not just an analytical one.
Okay.
And that's the ultimate, isn't that the ultimate goal of any art, to move the person encountering it so that you get past the technique and the composition, but to have an experience. That's what I always hope for.
Now, do you try to bring that sensibility? Some of your stories in the book are about visual art, or the place at RPI, this sort of electronic light. I mean, is it more difficult looking at something to have that emotional response? Particularly if it's very avant-garde or sort of...
I don't have a lot of depth in reviewing visual art. It's more about writing about the process of visual artists. The difference, I would say, is the immersion. In music is an art form that's about time, and visual art, it's easy to move in and out of it so quickly. So that's a difference. But I can think of times when I've been to a museum and my heart opens because of the beauty of the stuff. Same thing.
Okay. Well, now we spent so much on reviewing here.
And I will say that's the majority of what I'm known for. That's how I get so many. I can say I've done. It blew me away when I went into the archives to think about what I could pull together to make a book, that I had so many stories.
It said you had over 800 on file.
Right. So, many of those are the 400-word reviews.
Well, the bulk of the book is about little profiles of area artists and some people who are sort of famous when they're coming through town or within the 50-mile radius. I guess the book is Saratoga to Bard to Tanglewood to Glimmerglass, more or less.
Right.
That's a lot going on.
Exactly.
So these are profiles. There's literally everybody from visual artists. You got composers, dancers, musicians, filmmakers, a drag queen. You had a wide range here. When you're doing a profile, if you're going to do a story as opposed to review, what is it you're trying to get at if you're talking about a filmmaker, say, or whoever? What is it you're trying to get at when you?
Well, something of who they are and how that influences or comes through in what they produce and what they're putting before the public, and then in turn allowing the public to have a greater understanding of how what they're seeing or experiencing, or they may go see and buy a ticket for, came about. So the creative art, the creative process is a result of not just training and technique, but a soul, a human person, a personality, how someone was raised and how they live their life, whether they're an urban person or a country person, and all that. So the whole mix of what goes into who they are.
To what they became as they're. I mean, there's a story in here of an accordionist, say. I mean, there's a wide range of. Well, let's see. The section, you have a section here called activists.
Right.
How do you mean active? I mean, I know that these are all people who are involved in the arts, and they're sort of advocates for the area, our area, and so this group is separate.
I think if there's an overall premise for the book, it's that our art scene is not institutions, it's not buildings, it's not the big organizations that you think of, the Egg, the Albany Institute. These are great places that we can go to, but the art scene is people, and it's the artists, and it's the audiences, and it's the people that bring the artists and the audiences together, and that's what I call the activists. And so it's producers, impresarios, patrons, the people who underwrite, that sit on the board of trustees, the people that advise foundations, that kind of thing. So I thought it was a kicky word that, and the cover illustration has a kid doing chalk art on a sidewalk, and activists is a term that I came into knowing in the 90s as the people that are out on the streets marching in front of, striking or protesting and whatnot. And so something about taking things to the streets, and then the cover image is a kid on the street, making art on the street.
Well, one of the stories in that section is about the, I forgot their names now, the two guys who run the Colonie Music Hall. And they've really brought something to our area, and I think they've been there since 2002. So they're kind of activists. They're not out there, but they're really bringing a lot of stuff.
Yeah, no, there's nobody in here who's been picketing or anything. Yeah. That's just, it's an evocative word. But Jim and Charles from the producers of the Colonie Music Hall, there may be no more hardworking and dedicated people in the capital region for art, and they love putting on a show, and they love their building, but what they've done is brought life to Cahos. Oh, sure. And my God, Cahos can use some action, right? And so in that sense, it's art that is, they're producing art that does a lot more than just amuse people for 2 hours.
Well, I was just there Sunday, and even with all this work they do with all these shows.
Jim Charles, Tony Rivera, I got their names a little wrong.
I think Tony, besides all this other stuff he's doing, once a year he does the CBA musical, and this is a lot of work. He's a high school kid, so I'm thinking he was up there, But anyway, that was a good example of the activists. Now you devote a whole section in here to the gallery scene in our area, in Schenectady, Troy, Saratoga. I didn't know there was so many galleries. Why don't you talk about the gallery scene, which is way more active than I thought. Well,
what has emerged over my years of covering the scene have been these art nights. And I think a lot of it can be traced back to a group called Albany Underground Artists that were producing a one-night art show. And I don't know if you're like me, but particularly when I was in New York City, when there was so much you could take in, I would read about a museum show and think, that's great. Oh, it's up for 3 months. I'll get around to it, and before you know it, it's gone. Same thing even here. There's some, oh, that sounds good. I'll get over there within the month, and then it's gone. They went against that. They also went against actually using a gallery. They went into rundown buildings, worked something out with the landlord. We'll agree to paint your walls if you let us hang art and have people in. And they had a show that went up for just 1 or 2 days, a weekend, but one night really, more like a concert. And people turned out.
And this is in?
That was Albany, primarily Albany. And it really became a scene, and it became this thing you had to show up at. You had to keep your ear to the ground to find the next one. And I wrote the stories about it. Another newspaper, I feel like, has gotten more credit for it, but the Times-Union is the biggest circulation in the area, and I think I helped build their audience. That organization was very grassroots. It has some of the people involved in that are now part of UAG, Upstate Artists Guild. And if you want to find the most happening art night, the most happening gallery scene, I'm saying being part of the art scene is being around audience members. It's not just the art on the wall, it's being part of something. And when you go to a performance, you're with other people. Sometimes you're alone in a gallery. The first Fridays in Albany, all these different galleries have a party the same night.
Friday nights.
But UAG, Upstate Artists Guild, is in a space across from Bomber's Burrito Bar. Okay. And if you want to find the most happening single art night every month, go there that night. The first Friday every single month. Okay. So that is something that has happened First Friday is maybe 3 years old now. Troy, in turn, took on Troy Night Out, the last Friday of the month. Troy, beautiful buildings, interesting shops. Again, there's a lot of cars, but there's not many people on the sidewalk. Go to Troy Night Out, the last Friday of every single month, and you won't be alone in downtown Troy, and you'll feel better about Troy.
I have to go back to my hometown.
Exactly. So that's basically, I pulled the stories that trace this development, and I can't leave out Schenectady Art Night as well. So each of these 3 cities have a Friday night event where everybody has a party the same night.
And they're still ongoing now.
Absolutely.
Good.
Yeah.
And you devote a whole section to the book, to obviously your classical music background. You devote a whole section to Albany Symphony. So I was wondering, maybe you could talk about Albany Symphony. I have to say, I haven't really been there in so long. Is it?
You need to get out, Joe.
I know. What are they sort of an underrated, underappreciated area, or do they have a lot? I don't really know. Do they have a big subscriber base? Do they have full houses?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
We're recording now in mid-March, and they're going to be performing at Impact this Friday night, and it's sold out. It'll be their first full program at Impact, the new Arts Center in Troy. They can often sell out.
Okay.
Now, I don't have the long history with the Albany Symphony. I'm told they used to perform every program at the Palace Theater and at the Troy Music Hall, and they don't do that anymore. In the time I've been watching them, I would say they have a good, stable audience. One of the stories, there are 6 stories in that section about the Albany Symphony, and one of them was written for Symphony Magazine, which is the publication of the League of American Orchestras. And I called the editor of that magazine, said who I was, said I've been covering this group for 5 years, and he said, absolutely, we want a story on them. We know they're doing something. We know things are going on there. And so they have a national reputation, and that reputation is for contemporary music. And
contemporary meaning not Beethoven and all that.
Exactly,
Okay.
and not even Gershwin.
Okay.
But living American composers. And as a journalist and as someone who produced recordings of contemporary composers, living American composers, that's just like chocolate cake. To be able to don't ask me to write a Sunday story about singing the praises of the late Mozart violin sonatas, but to write about a new piece of music that is inspired by a William Kennedy novel, and the Albany Symphony has commissioned 2 of those. That's juicy
Now,
stuff.
is this uncommon for major symphony orchestras?
Absolutely, yes. And now, the Albany Symphony is not a major.
But
it's
still.
a regional orchestra. It is fully professional, and it is very uncommon. Things I've been following, music for 20, 30 years now, and the penetration of contemporary music into mainstream programming, I would say, has gotten better and better. But the Albany Symphony will do a new or recent, usually American work on every subscription program, which is once a month for them, September through May. There aren't many groups anywhere in the country that do that.
Okay, so you're liable to see something written last year or something.
Exactly. And you'll hear the composer talk. They'll have the composer there. And that ties into what I want the book to do, to experience who it is that made this thing you're experiencing.
Well, your profiles do bring out these things about people that, that connects them with their work.
Thank you. I hope so. Good.
One thing I want to ask you about, in the introduction, you talk about, or the book has profiles of a lot of gay and lesbian artists, and in the introduction you say, or there's a comment about, there's an awful lot of stories about gay people these days, and you said, well, I just think people are telling the rest of the story. What does that mean, you're telling the rest of the story?
Before I was writing about the arts, I was reading about the arts. I was trying to get some of my artists covered, and it just seemed like the arts have a lot of gays and lesbians. That's a given, but that where a story in a mainstream press might mention a man's wife and children or something, that there was just something missing there about the fact that there was a same-sex companion or partner or something. And so I just try to tell it if it's there and they're comfortable talking about it. And at the same time, I've done lots of stories about gay and lesbian artists, the artists who are gay and lesbian, but that is not the heart of their work. Mm-hmm. It's just, and by the way, there's this. That being said, in classical music, I write for magazines now and then, including The Advocate, the National Gay and Lesbian News magazine. There are gay and lesbian artists who do not want to be out, and so being part of the community myself, if someone is comfortable with it, I want to give a tip of the hat to them as well.
Okay, well, finally now, as we can wrap up here, what would you say about the state of the arts for our region? Meaning this, what I talked about before, this whole, would you say the current and maybe future scenes? Do you see it really accelerating or getting even better than it?
The economy is on everyone's mind, and so I am aware of retrenching. I mean, just the facts are, I mentioned the Berkshire Opera, I think may not have a season. New York City
may not have a season?
Right.
Oh, okay.
Right. New York City Ballet is coming for 2 weeks instead of 3. Glimmer Glass Opera is starting 2 weeks later this year than every year in the past. I'm waiting to see what the Albany Symphony has in store for next year. So I think there is some retrenching on the institutional level. There's less cash. The major institutions rely on an endowment, which is stocks. And the stock market is down 30%. So, at every level, I think there's some contracting. Again, an art scene is not just, though, the institutions. And so, in terms of the big picture of our art scene, it's not going anywhere, and there's a lot. Joe, you're a perfect example. There's a lot more out there than a lot of us think there is, and it's of a very high quality. You don't have to go to New York City to experience high quality art.
Well, last summer I went to Down-Desert Bard for the first time, and it was tremendous. I mean, that's only, 50 miles? Not even?
Yeah, it's a little more than an hour.
So within an hour in our circumference, there's tons of stuff going on.
And the urge to create, and to show, whether it's a concert or a gallery show or a theatrical production, that doesn't go away. And well, that's
going to be there no matter what the economy is.
Exactly.
Well, Joe, thanks. The book, Artist and Activist, this is our library copy, so you can check it out at our library, but Joe probably wouldn't mind if you bought one. You can get it at all the local bookstores. And
shall I mention also, I'm going to be appearing at one of your sister libraries.
Yes, if you want to see Joe speak, you can tell us about this. We can talk about other libraries, that's okay.
Good. I will be at the Albany Public Library during, I think it's National Library Week, Thursday, April 23rd, 7 p.m. It's a free event, an hour long. I will try and say some different things than I've said here, and books will be for sale. I'd be happy to meet people, and I like knowing my readers. I like knowing I have an audience.
All right, well, good. So if you want to meet Joe, April 23rd at Albany Public, 7 o'clock, and thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you. It's been fun.
All right, that's it for Meet the Author, and we'll see you next time.